for a while. Then she became Queen of England when she left her French husband and married the King of England. The Third Crusade was perhaps the most energetic crusade that Europe ever attempted, and it might have succeeded, even in spite of the fact that Saladin was a capable ruler, but it featured three of Europe's strongest kings going against Saladin, but it failed. One king drowned, the other king turned back, and that left Richard the Lionhearted to try to fight Saladin by himself, and he simply didn't have a big enough army to do so. The Fourth Crusade, they were the ones who sacked Constantinople and ran Constantinople for something like 40 years. And yes, I did mention, so I'll mention again, the Children's Crusade. It's not in the book. The Black Plague hit around 1307, but Europe experienced the big famine between 1313 and 1317. The famine, of course, was brought on by really, really short, cool summers and long, cold winters, where the last frost would occur too late to grow some of their crops, and the first frost would occur too early. The climate eventually warmed, but folks, some experts believe, and it can't be proven, that we still have not warmed up to what the climate was between 1000 and 1300. That we still have a ways to go before it warms up that warm. The black rat, it wasn't the black rat that spread the plague, it was the fleas on the black rat that spread the plague. The black rat originated in Central Asia, and they followed the Mongolians westward. Then Genoese merchants in 1347 brought the disease to Sicily, and it's killed off 1/3 of Europe's population. In some cases, whole towns disappeared to be grown over by vegetation, undergrowth, weeds, and never recover. If you look at more detail, Europe started to recover its population in the 1600s, and in the late 1600s, another climate dip knocked the population down again. I mentioned this, that the revolts, peasant revolts was to last from the 1300s until the mid-1800s. The year 1848 was like the last of them. Did any of you happen to see a movie that came out a couple years ago called Les Miserables? That one dealt with the revolution of 1832. The one Karl Marx was so upset because the poor people did not gain more by it. But there were revolutions in 1830, 1832, and 1848. All this was to continue eventually. Now, at first, the peasants seemed to gain nothing. But eventually, as time went on, the peasantry gained more and more. And eventually, the peasantry brought down the nobility completely. And today, hardly any European country has anything other than a figurehead king, if they even have that. Great Britain has a figurehead queen. Spain has a figurehead king. Germany and Russia no longer, and France, three of Europe's more powerful, can no longer acknowledge any kind of king, figurehead or otherwise. Romania doesn't have a king. Most of European countries, now Denmark does have one, but the king of Denmark has sometimes been seen in grocery stores shopping for groceries like an ordinary person. His servants do not do that for him. but Denmark has a figurehead king. Norway still has a figurehead king. But the nobility in Europe has very little power compared to what it once had. And again, a lot of this is due to generation after generation of peasant rebellions. The dynasties of France, I did want you to remember the first one we talked about was the Merovingian. It was followed by the Capetian, then followed by the Carolingian, and finally the House of Valois. Don't worry about the House of Valois so much, but the Capetian dynasty, Hugh Capet. The Merovingian dynasty, the most famous of its kings was King Clovis. Clovis was a king of the Merovingian dynasty. Don't worry about this Saxons or Dormant, that will not be on. But Abbot ruled, I did mention that. The Abbot was the ruler of a monastery. The titles, the Duke, the Count. Again, they might be comparable to governor of a state today. All right, while you're looking that up, I'm going to better pause and see who's here. Backing up a bit. This will not be on the test. Do learn the two things from right here. Thomas Becket, he said only the church courts should try clerics. Folk, they had problems then about clerics who sometimes misbehaved in one form or another. And that Henry said, hey, this, when they do wrong, is a crime against the state. Now, folk, you might know this is still an issue because some 18, 20 years ago, when a lot of priests were accused of indiscretions with young children, what the church often is accused of doing, instead of sending these accused to secular courts to be tried, they'd simply move them halfway across the globe where that nobody would know them. And that was one thing that really tarnished the reputation of Pope John Paul II and tarnished the reputation of the Pope who followed him because he was in charge of overseeing that justice was carried out. Today it's not practical because today you get on the internet and look anybody up and it's easy to do. But at one time, and this was true not just among Catholics, but a lot of clergymen who misbehaved would simply be transported by the church to somewhere far away where nobody would know them, to where they could hopefully start all over. Now, the problem with that, folks, you may have guessed, much too often, if a person were really guilty here, he'd go over somewhere else and do the same thing. But the church officials who misbehaved were supposed to be tried by, according to the Pope, they were supposed to be tried by the church. According to Henry, they were supposed to be tried by the state. The issue got so bad that eventually Thomas Becket became a martyr over the issue, and this set Henry back quite a bit. Now, King John. It was said that King John had all the vices of the people in the Middle Ages without any of their redeeming virtues. It was known that he would just sometimes throw big fits and get down on the floor and wallow around and just yell at the top of his voice and scare all the dogs and everybody else away. Just simply a man given over to his passions. But he's the one who was forced to sign the Magna Carta. Don't worry about the date, don't worry about Runnymede. But do remember the Magna Carta. He's associated with King John. And Winston Churchill was to say many centuries later that England might owe more to the vices of King John than it did to the virtues of many a great statesman who followed him. The Magna Carta was one of the first attempts that England made to limit the power of their kings. And then as time went on, the power of the kings was made less and less and less. But maybe thanks in large part to the Magna Carta, at least is still King John's, one of his descendants is still sitting on the throne of England today. Yes, Queen Elizabeth II is descended from John, among other kings. Whereas a lot of countries in Europe no longer acknowledge that they have any king. I mentioned Eleanor of Aquitaine. Yeah, tournaments. I don't know if I talked much about tournaments. If you remember, have any of you ever been to the Renaissance Festival that they used to hold? They'll get knights going at each other in armor, and they'll try to knock each other off the horse. And yes, I've got that on my video camera. My wife and I went to one back in 1988. It's been going on for a good many years, but it still goes on. But I don't care to see it again. But the warfare is something the nobility was plagued by, and for folk, you might wonder why they like warfare so much. Well, in those days, a knight in armor was seldom killed in battle. It was a way that they could fight and hack away at the lesser, poorer people, but even against each other, they would simply hack away each other without really hurting each other. Their armor protected them. Now, this was the change of the 100 Years' War, when the English learned that a long, long bow, 6-foot-long bow, could penetrate armor, and the gun, especially. The gun outdid a lot of the knights in armor. But at one time, the nobility seemed to just love warfare, where tournaments became what we might call the moral. One person wrote a book called The Moral Equivalent of War, and he said things like our baseball games and football games between cities are almost like a moral way that cities can compete with each other, or colleges can compete with each other in a moral way without killing each other. The tournaments were games that the knights would play where they would get the thrill of fighting without doing each other in. Chivalry, the ideal of the knight, to define the knight's relationship to women